Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. Ah, okay. All the next day, in the broiling sun, he worked without pause. Well, I'm reading this down from. He attacked the ground as though he had a grudge against it. Memories of the evening before were going round and round in his mind, and he was trying to fathom what had happened and why. His whole body was charged with frustration and anger and a yearning for Lily, as he had never yearned for anyone before. He felt sick whenever he wondered what she must think of him. He knew he had to find some way of making things up to her, but how? That evening, depressed and coldly angry, he wandered into town and found Malone in the Elephant and Castle. Drink up, Malone said. I'm way ahead. Jack realized he must be in the early stages of a binge. Does Dan know where you are? Dan doesn't know everything, old friend. Have a drink. He had a bottle of cheap Cape brandy on the table. I ain't drinking that stuff. Jack fetched himself a whiskey. They sat together for an hour. Jack's mind was elsewhere. Malone became steadily the worse for drink. The Eastern Transvaal, he was saying when Jack gave him a moment's attention. They've been panning it in the rivers. Tons of it. What? Gold, my friend. Gold. This place is finished. Once we get through the yellow ground and into the blue, it's over. There are some that's got into the blue ground already. The Transvaal, that's where I'll be heading as soon as I've got a poke. He drank from his glass of brandy. I've never did like diamonds. Cold, miserable things. Gold's the stuff. I've been after gold in California and Mexico. It's warm, got a heart to it. Friendly stuff. He was mumbling to himself now. Jack looked at him, and the chill of depression grew. Was he also going to be a drunk when he was Malone's age? Was was he also going to be bore everyone with histories of past strikes and future hopes? Nuggets in the pools? Why, I heard of one the other day that weighed nearly 3 pounds. Money, Jack thought. He had to have money. He recalled the four men in the restaurant the previous evening. They had all looked prosperous. And then Arendt airily saying, put it on my account. And the waiter had presented the bill. And thank Christ too, for it was more than he had. The key was money. It was the key to Lily, the key to happiness itself. But how to make it? A few bob in my pocket, and you won't see me for dust, Malone said. Was that Loth's secret? Money? Why else was a woman like Lily? He tried not to think about it. He wanted to take Lotha in his hands, and a thought came, fully formed, into his head. He stood up. Have another drink, Malone said. I'm off. Come on, old friend. Jack hurried across the square to where the Misham wagons were parked. Willikins was the last in the line. He knocked at the door. What the bloody hell do you want? Wilkins said. I got something to put to you. If it's about Lily, you can forget it. You bastard. It's about money. Money for you. Wilkins scowled but moved back, and Jack followed, bending his head and sliding onto a chair. The wagon was the same design as Lily's, but without the atmosphere of luxury and care. Wilkins sat on his bunk. There was a table, an enamel basin, a cheap enamel jug for his ablutions, and a cupboard which contained food. On the table was a half finished bottle of brandy. You having one? Wilkins said, with ill concealed dislike. He was a small, bandy, runty man with hair parted down the middle and bad teeth. Years of shouting had given him a gravel voice. Jack shook his head. No, I got something to say to you. About money, wasn't it? That's it. You got my attention. You got a boxer in Lothar, only he don't fight proper. What do you mean by that? He have killed you. I'm coming to that. It's this 3 round stuff. How do you make your money? Collection. That's it. Passing around the hat. That ain't a very certain way. Wilkins drank a mouthful of brandy and said, You got a better way? Why not box him proper? He's a champ, ain't he? Put him against someone good. Then stage it right with a proper ring and chairs and everything and charge entrance. Wilkins shook his head. You got to have a decent challenger for that. There ain't no one here who could challenge the Batavian giant. Not enough to bring in the paying customers. I could find you one. Who? Me? You? Don't make me laugh, Sonny. You've been done already by Lothar. He may chop liver. He may chop liver off you. I was drunk. Listen, I knows how to fight. Did my share of it before the mast. Now, there's a lot of people in this town that knows that Lothar and me don't get on, and that's putting it mildly. Wilkins had him with more interest. We could stir things up a bit. Make out it's a hate fight. That won't be far wrong, Jack said. What do you get out of it? A share in the money. How big a share? Uh, that's what we got to talk about. They talked for nearly 2 hours, and it was late when Jack got to bed. Wilkins worked quickly, and by the following afternoon, Jack found he was something of a celebrity. Diggers spoke too. Diggers spoke to him as he walked in the claim, and men he had never met came up and wished him luck. Some even gave him advice. It was an easy fight to promote. With his dark skin, his exotic tattoos, his ugly manner, his very foreignness, Lothar was roundly disliked. He knew it. It was part of his trade. He was, as Wilkins told Jack, the one they loved to hate. He suited the place and the time, for Kimberley was a town of men who saw fraternity in what they were doing. They were all struggling to make a living, all in the same boat. This gave them unity. The town came down heavily on the side of Jack. The Diamond and Val Advertiser published a story about the fight. It was talked about in all the bars and cozies. But while Jack was known as the digger's choice, which meant that popular sentiment was behind him, it did not mean people thought he would win. They did not. They had seen Lothar in action. Some had even seen his previous fight with Jack. The fight was set for 5 o'clock in the evening in 4 days' time. This would give everyone the chance to get back from the diggings. Wilkins had decided not to bother hiring shares, but to put the ring up at the base of a small hill called a kopje, the side of which would act as a natural ramp. At first, there were to be no rules, but then the diggers' committee decided that Jack might be killed, so they would fight with mufflers and, according to Queensberry, there would be no gouging, kicking, or biting. At first, Wilkins had wanted a fight to the finish, but now a limit of 30 rounds was agreed. Not everyone was happy. Lily went to see Jack as the claim to 2 days before the fight. He had kept away from her, promising himself that after the fight things would be different between them. He would have real money then, even if he had lost. Jack, David, David called down to him. You've got a visitor. The heat was bad, and Jack was covered in a layer of sweat and dust. He came up the swing ladders to the rim of the mine and saw her. Men in other claims had stopped to look, not only because any woman was rare on the rim, but because it was said that she was the cause of the light of the fight. It gave her an aura of mystery and romance. She was hatless, and her black hair hung down to her shoulders and shone in the strong sunlight. Again, her colors were red and black. Jack felt embarrassed at his own dirt and nakedness and put on his shirt. I have come to ask you not to fight, she said. Why not? She hesitated, then she said, because I like you, Jack. And when Lothar wants to, I can look after myself. I know you can, but he's a champion. He's being trained for it. Remember what he did to you last time? Hey, I was drunk. Are you set on it then? Yes. Is it is it because of me? He looked down at his work-stained hands. Because if it is, the arrangements have been made, he said. Susan Delport was also against the fight. She and Marie had come into town to shop, and they took him to Madame Delatty's French cafe for pasties and tea. As he was shaking the bottle of vinegar sauce over his plate, Susan said, You were lucky last time. He might have killed you. Marie took a different line. Father's going to take me. The whole town will be there. I wish you wouldn't, Susan said. I saw your bruises. It'll be all right, Jack said. But inside, he was not so sure. Okay. 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 Mm, 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 mm. Ba-da-ba-da-bum, bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, 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 bum. fight was to be on a Saturday. Word had reached the outlying districts, and farm wagons began to arrive in Kimberley from early morning. Many people decided to combine their monthly shopping with the fight, and all the roads carried plumes of dust as wagons, traps, and Scotch carts converged on the town. Few of its residents could remember seeing it so full. The square was packed by breakfast time. The bars opened at 8. The halls were woken and set to work, and it was queuing at Madame Delatty's for a cup of coffee. By midday, many wagons were heading for the boxing ring, which stood at the base of the kopje. Wilkins had done well, seeing for once the chance of a lifetime. He had spent money to make money. He had hired a dozen large diggers to act as ushers, and they spread the wagons in a semicircle on the side of the ring opposite the slope of a small hill. So on one side was the hill, giving a good view, and on the other the wagons from which the spectators could also see. Soon the expanse of veldt around the ring was filled by wagons and bullocks, and stalls which sold lemonade and pies, sandwiches and beer. There were sideshows, darts, and shove a penny, crown and anchor, dice, even a fortune teller. Some people were reminded of Epsom Downs on Derby Day. The only thing wrong was the weather. The day had dawned clear, but black thunder clouds had quickly covered the sky, and by early afternoon, the, at- the atmosphere was heavy and sticky. Wilkins was seen to look up at the sky every few minutes, and once he shook his fist at it. People said he was threatening God. Jack woke early. David was already dressing. Jack said, "I'll not be coming today. I didn't think you would." David took his food and cold coffee and left. It was almost the first time the two men had spoken to each other for days. Jack lay back in his bed, a luxury he would have given good money for on many a morning, but now he was uneasy. He was not used to being in the tent at this hour, especially by himself. He began to think of David. What had gone wrong? When they had started off, they had been pals. He had never had a friend before, and then everything had disintegrated to a point where now they hardly spoke to each other. There was one thing he had been putting off: who to ask to be in his corner and act as his second. He had thought of Dan Halkett and had intended to see him that morning. Now he decided to ask David. He dressed and went to the claim. David was filling the bucket with spoil, and he waited until it reached the rim. "What are you doing here?" David was covered in dust and seemed already worn out from the work. "You should be resting." "I wanted to." "What?" To ask. Jack stopped. It was no use. They stared at each other for a few seconds, then he turned and walked down towards Halkett's claim. By a quarter to 5 that afternoon, the veldt around the boxing ring was packed, and so was the slope of the hill. Money had come in like a silver stream, and many farmers had taken down the hoods on their wagons and were charging standing room, much to Wilkins's chagrin. Jack, Dan Halkett, and Joseph Malone arrived with Franz and Marie Delport. A space at the ringside had been reserved for their wagon. Marie saw herself at the center of things and was flushed with excitement. Even Franz had been caught by the crowd's restlessness. As usual, Dan left the talking to Malone. "Watch his eyes," Malone was saying. "Don't worry about his hands. I handled a boy in Cripple Creek, Colorado once fight like this, except they had fallen out over money. Big, slow-moving boy. Came from Missouri, as I recall." Jack was not listening. As the Dalport's wagon came to a halt, a few diggers recognized Jack and started to cheer. It was taken up by others and grew in volume. Stand up, Jack, Malone said. Let him see you. Jack stood, and Marie stepped up onto the box with him. Wave, she said, and raised her own hand. Get down, Franz said. The cheering turned to booing. A small trap had reached the ringside. Lothar, in his dirty red silk dressing gown, was stepping down. With him were Wilkins and Lily. The booing reached a crescendo as he climbed through the ropes and stood in the ring. He stared at the crowd, contempt on his face. Jack was watching Lily. She took one of the few chairs at the ringside, and then he saw that just behind her were Peter Arendt, David, Hilda Levinson, and the German, von Holzmann. Arendt moved to sit next to Lily. Come on, Hockett said. It's time. Jack did not hear the voices wishing him luck, nor feel the pats on his bare back as he moved to the ringside and climbed through the ropes. He looked down at Lily. Arendt was talking animatedly, but she was not listening. She was looking up at Jack, and her face was white and still. He tried to smile, but his lips were frozen. Wilkins threw him a pair of mufflers, like gloves with a minimum of padding. They did not have laces and were kept on by the act of clenching the fists. Dan and Joe were in his corner. Someone had placed a chair there, and he sat down. Dan began to massage his arms and legs. Watch his eyes, Joe said. Don't forget now. Dan said nothing. Jack looked across at Lothar. He seemed massive. He had sustained the chair in his corner and was leaning against the ropes. His dressing gown lay on his shoulders and his arms were folded. He looked for all the world like a man deep in thought. He can't be that calm, Jack thought. His own stomach was crawling with nerves. As he looked closer, he could see the pouches under Lothar's eyes, the bulge of his belly under his folded arms. The referee, a big Belgian who had once been champion of Antwerp, entered the ring. The crowd fell silent. Queensberry rules, he told each man in turn. Then he said, Come on. Wilkins hit a gong, and the fight started. Those who saw it that afternoon under the lowering sky with thunder rumbling on the distant hills and the occasional flash of lightning would remember it because of its aftermath, and that would color their stories. But while it was taking place, few saw any pattern to it. There was a pattern, though. In a fight scheduled to last for more than 2 hours, neither man wanted to start badly. A few blows were thrown, and one or two landed, and each was surprised at the other's strength. Soon, in the heavy, hot atmosphere, both were dripping with sweat, and Jack felt it stinging his eyes. For the first half-dozen rounds, they traded blows and broke away, came forward again. In one of the exchanges, Jack was caught on the side of the nose, and he felt tears come to his eyes and tasted the blood. He had told himself to be calm, that anger would lose him the fight, but he felt it flare up suddenly, for the blow had hurt. Lothar seemed too relaxed, and too uncaring. Jack launched himself in a vicious attack. Lothar fell back, taking some blows on the gloves and allowing others to whistle past his head. Jack pressed on. He heard Malone's voice yelling behind him. He did not see the blow. One moment he was flailing forward, trying to get his right hand to Lothar's head. The next, he felt a tremendous blow over his heart. He fell and tasted the damp sawdust. Get up! The crowd roared. He could not breathe. He heard a voice begin to count. He came forward onto his knees and pulled himself up to the ropes. At that moment the gong went, and with legs like jelly, he managed to get back to his corner and flop on his chair. He was giddy and felt slightly sick. Then there was a sudden chill as a sponge of water was pressed against his face. "What round is it?" he said. "Seventh," Malone said. "You nearly had him, Jack. I thought he was going there. That's the only way. You've got to get in one good one. Then it'll be all over." Halkett said nothing. By the end of the 12th round, Jack was marked on his face, chest, and arms. He was swallowing blood from the blow to his nose, and his left eye was beginning to close. "You've got him," Malone said excitedly. "Another round like that one, and you'll finish him off." But Dan Halkett, who had been using the sponge to try and reduce the swelling of the eye, turned and said softly, "Be quiet now, Joe." He turned back to Jack. "He's a boxer. You're a fighter. The only way you can beat a man like that is to wear him down. You've got to dance, Jack. Keep away from him. Dance." The ring was a big one, and it was easy enough to keep his distance. Lothar had been used to standing his ground or moving slowly backwards as Jack came at him. Now he was forced to attack. Each time he came forward, Jack slid away either to the right or left. "Dance," Dan had said. It was the one word that stayed in his mind. The crowd didn't like it. They had been shouting for Lothar's blood, anyone's blood. They felt they were being cheated. They began to jeer. The light had gone out for the day, and with the heavy dark clouds, visibility was poor. After an hour, Wilkins lit the torches. Jack realized that for 3 or 4 rounds he had been boxing a shadow. Now he saw Lothar more clearly. He saw the reds and blues of the tattoos, the rivulets of sweat, but he also saw something that gave him hope. Lothar's face looked 10 years older. Dan was right. The only way to beat him was to tire him out. Dance, Jack said to himself. He also began to use his left hand. He flicked it out and caught Lothar in the mouth, and this time there was no reply for Jack. For Jack danced out of the way, his bare feet holding the boards as they would have held the deck of a ship. Flick, flick. Lothar came on with his slow shuffle. There were other indications of his exhaustion. His hands, which at the start had covered his face and body and seemed to form an impenetrable wall, had dropped, leaving him open to Jack's long left arm. The look in his eyes had changed. Earlier, they had been filled with contempt both for Jack and the crowd. Now they seemed almost like a dead man's eyes. The 18th round passed. The 19th. The 20th. The pattern remained the same. Jack flicking his left into Lothar's face, and the Batavian giant himself coming forward like a clumsy bear as the strength drained out of him. Jack was able to hit him with his left at will. Each time, a blow landed the crowd. Each time a blow landed, the crowd bellowed. Sometimes in the clinches, the two men's faces rubbed against each other, mingling the blood that dripped from both. The crowd was yelling to Jack to finish him, and he thought, "I'll give them their money's worth." He suddenly reversed his tactics. I can't speak. He moved forward, jabbing, waiting for a chance to use his powerful right. Lothar began to retreat. Jack moved in quickly for the kill. Then things went wrong. Lothar held his ground, and as Jack threw his right, he saw too late Lothar's left hand go up. The blow was taken harmlessly on Lothar's muffler. Then Lothar hit him on the side of the head. It was a terrible blow, and he felt as though his eyes were coming out. Lothar hit him again. He crashed backwards against the ropes, then was catapulted forward. He grabbed Lothar for support. For a moment, the two men were entangled and unable to get at each other. Jack's head was against Lothar's chest, and below him was the soft bulge of the belly. He had Lothar's right arm trapped against his side. He knew he had only one chance, and he drove his fist as hard as he could into the soft, brown, tattooed mass. There were some among the spectators who would always maintain that he had struck Lothar below the belt, and that it was a foul blow. Others were as certain that it had been fair. No one would ever be sure. Not Lothar, not Jack, not even the referee, who had been unsighted at that moment. Malone thought it a fair blow, and said so whenever the fight was mentioned. And it was talked of a great deal then, and in the years to come. Dan Halkett was never heard to give an opinion. Peter Arendt, Lily, and David had been on the far side of the ring, with Lothar's broad back blocking their view. On one thing, there was no disagreement. It was the blow that finished Lothar and stopped the fight. It is true that Jack hit him several more blows as he stood swaying on his feet, but everyone agreed that they had no sting in them by that time. There was also general agreement that Lothar could not have been expecting the blow. Jack's whole fist went in. Malone said later to anyone who would listen. In and in. I thought it was going clean through him. Jack himself remembered little about the fight, but he did remember how it ended. He remembered his own desperate plight. He remembered hitting Lothar as hard as he could. He remembered feeling his fist travel deep into the soft interior of the belly. Lothar had staggered backwards, holding his stomach, his mouth working, trying to pull air into his exploded lungs. Then Jack had hit him 3 times in the face. Slowly the Batavian giant had toppled sideways and collapsed like an uprooted tree. The crash of his fall was heard above the thunder of the oncoming storm. Many spectators thought it was thunder. There was something about the manner of his fall that told people he was finished, and Lily had jumped to her feet as the referee counted him out. Jack raised his tired arms above his head, and the crowd cheered him. Mary was jumping up and down on the wagon. Franz was waving his hand. He saw Peter Arendt clapping slowly. He saw David look at him, then look away. The ring was full of people. He felt himself hoisted onto shoulders and carried about in triumph. Wilkins was bending over Lothar, who had not moved. Lily had come through the ropes. Few were paying attention to the Batavian giant. Most were cheering Jack. Then he heard a voice saying, "Let me through, I'm a doctor." A man with a Gladstone bag climbed onto the sawdust. The big ushers restored order, and Jack saw several policemen form up at the base of the hill to stop the crowd from surging forward. He managed to release himself from the diggers who were carrying him, and scrambled up onto the wagon. "Jack! Jack!" Marie said, breathless with excitement. She flung her arms around his neck and kissed the blood and dirt. Franz was patting him on the back. "Man, you fought like a champion. I thought you were going to go down, but then... Man, it was something." Malone arrived with his congratulations. Jack looked past him and saw Dan Halkett. "I danced," he said. "Yes, you danced." The wagon was surrounded by people who had come to shake his hand, and it was not until Malone said, "They're taking him away," that he saw Lothar being carried to the trap by four men, with the doctor and Lily walking alongside him. He was still unconscious. There was a bucket of water, and Jack washed himself as well as he could. He was putting on his shirt when the storm, which had been threatening for hours, finally broke. Rain lashed down for 10 minutes, sending the spectators hurrying back to town, and then, as quickly as it had come, it passed south, leaving the air fresher. "What are you going to do now?" Franz Stoppard asked Jack. It was something to which he had given no thought. "I don't know." "We'll all go into town," Murray said. "We'll celebrate." "That's it. We'll make a night of it," Jack said, wondering how he was going to find Lily. "You can't just leave," Franz said. "Don't you care that what happens to him?" "Jason," Jack said, "I'll go and find out." The hospital was a one-roomed building made of the usual corrugated iron. It was the size of a small chapel, with a waiting room at the front. Lights were on when he arrived. He pushed open the front door and saw Lily. She was sitting on a hard wooden bench, the only piece of furniture except for a raised desk where a nurse would have been sitting during the day. As he entered, she turned towards him. For a moment, he felt afraid of what she might say. He thought he saw anger in her face. He stood in the doorway, rubbing his huge hands together like a child. Her expression changed. "It's good of you to come, Jack." "How is he?" The doctor is with him. The doctor is with him." "I don't think," he began. "I mean, it wasn't as though it wasn't your fault. It might have happened the other way." The doctor came out. He was a tall, raw-boned Swede called Axelson, whose owned a claim near New Chance. "Not good," he said to Lily's inquiry. "He has injury here." He pointed to his midriff. "Something is damaged. The spleen, I think. He must wait to see what happens." "Is it very bad?" "Yeah, I think so. Very bad." "Can I see him?" The doctor shrugged. "It cannot do harm. I go now for my meal. Later I come back." Jack followed her into the ward. Lothar was the only patient. A nurse was sitting at a desk at the far end of the ward, lit by a small lamp. "Please, be quiet," she said. They looked down at Lothar. He appeared very different from the big man Jack had fought. His face was relaxed, and the lines of age were plainly visible. His skin was a dark yellow in color. It was very hot in the ward, and he was sweating. Lily took a cloth and wiped his forehead. "Are you going to wait?" the nurse asked. "Yes," Lily said. "I'll call you if there's any change." They returned to the front room. "Your friends must be waiting for you," she said. He shook his head. "I'd rather stay, if that's all right." She smiled slightly. "You're a strange man. Come and sit down." She moved along the bench, giving him a space. This is what I feared," she said. "Getting hurt. If you do what he did for a living, you take your chances." He was going to stop. This was his last tour. He wanted to buy a lodging house down the river near Gravesend. Wanted me to come and run it for him. "Would you?" She shrugged. "Hadn't made up my mind. Sometimes I think, well, it's better than the life I've got. But sometimes, what is it to you? Jack said. That's no business of yours. Two spots of color had appeared on her cheeks. It was the question foremost in Jack's mind, and he had blurted it out without thinking. He was startled at her reaction. People are always asking about Lothar, she said. They don't understand him, so they hate him. They wonder about him and they wonder about me, as if it's any of their business. He wants to be hated, Jack said. She looked up at him sharply, surprised at his perception. The more you hate him, the more you come to see him. That's what Mr. Mitchum always said. He wasn't always like this. When I first knew him, he was a strong man. There were no tattoos then, no boxing. He'd been iron bars and left things with his teeth. When I first joined Mr. Mitchum, I was only 16, and we had an act where Lothar would swing from a bar and I would swing from an ankle rope he held in his teeth. But we had to give that up after a time because of his eyes. Sometimes they'd be bleeding when little veins burst, and sometimes he'd see double. Then he had to give up his strongman act because he injured his stomach picking up the weights. Jack had a momentary vision of the soft, tender belly and his fist going into it. We were in Australia then, and when he healed, he couldn't lift any more. So Mr. Mitchum said, you should get tattooed and start the boxing booth. He never used to be tattooed. He never used to box. I thought he had been at it for years, him being the Batavian giant. That was Mr. Mitchum's name for him. He's no champion of Batavia or anywhere. He was born in Singapore. His father was a German seaman. His mother was a Chinese girl. He lived there until he was grown up. I taught him what little English he knows. He was good to me at first, but then she raised her hand and let it drop. They heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside and Wilkins came in. His small monkey face was red, and Jack realized he had had several drinks. Well, you done it, Hare. Well, you done it, lad, he said. And there's a good lot coming your way. How's Lothar? Very bad, Lily said. Stomach? The doctor says there's something smashed inside him. It's getting dark. It's getting dark. It's getting dark. Ooh, let there be light. Let there be light. Wilkins shook his head slowly. It had to be. I knew it from the first. Once he had done himself lifting those weights, I said to Mr. Mitchum, that's I'm finished. But there was nothing else he could do, and he had to do something if he was to stay with us. He lit a large cigar. Well, I got business. There's payments to be made. I'll look in later. Jack followed him into the street. How much? He said. Wilkins cleared his throat. Well, now, Jack, I ain't absolutely sure. Guess. It's got to be 400 quid. For me alone? That's it, lad. Christ. Come and see me in the morning. Jack went back into the hospital in a daze. 400 quid. It was better than finding a diamond. The doctor came about 11, but there was no change. At midnight, the nurse made the cups of tea, and then she went into the ward and slept on another bed. You've never told me about yourself, Lily said. I know you come from London, but that's about all. You'd not be interested in my past. If we're not to fall asleep, we're going to have to keep ourselves interested. You tell me, and I'll be the judge. But Jack's early life was close to others as well as to himself. The horror of his mother's death, and life, for that matter, had made him shut out the past. He never told anyone about Mary or Mr. Burgess or Truman Rutter. They were all part of another life. Come on now, Lily said. Fair's fair. The very thought of exposing his past made him nervous, and he began to walk up and down, sensing that he could not be pressed. She said, Have you eaten? I'm not hungry. Nor me. He sat down at the desk and suddenly felt overwhelmingly tired. The physical energy drained out of him, and he rested his head on his folded arms. In an instant, he was asleep. He awoke, stiff and sore. Lily had stretched out on the bench and was sleeping on the side. Her mouth was slightly open, and he could see her white teeth. He had an overwhelming desire to kiss her, to force his tongue inside her lips. But even as he thought of it, he smelled his own rank body smell. He had only washed perfunctorily, perfunctorily after the fight. He was filthy. Perfunctorily, what is the word? Perfunc, perfunctorily, perfunctorily. After the fight, he was filthy. He left the hospital without waking her. It was later than he had thought, and the day had begun. He went to the tent, but David had already left for the mine. He took a change of clothing to the Anglo-African slipper baths. People in the streets recognized him. Some shook his hand. Some patted him on the back. Some waved. After bathing and shaving, he returned to the hospital. He was crossing the square when he remembered that the Mitcham wagons were parked nearby. He decided to collect his money. He knocked on the door of Wilkins' wagon and, getting no reply, pushed open the door. Wilkins was not on his bunk. He went to the other wagons, but they were empty too. Wilkins had said he would be returning to the hospital, and Jack hurried in that direction. Lily was no longer in the waiting room. He heard a noise from the ward, a cry, and sounds of a struggle. He flung open the door. Lothar was out of bed. His body was naked and he was drenched with sweat. Lily and the nurse were trying to hold his arms. His eyes were wild and there was blood on his lips. For God's sake, help us, Lily said. Jack ran to her. There wasn't much strength left in Lothar's body, but it was still too much for the woman. Easy now, he said, putting the man's arms from behind. Lothar tried to turn, but Jack held tightly. Come on! He began to pull Lothar back towards the bed. For a moment, he seemed to understand. Be careful, Lily said. I've got him. Then Lothar stopped. His eyes cleared, and he looked directly at Lily. For a second, everyone stood still. Then he gave a great cry. Lily! All his life, Jack was to remember it. Then the Batavian giant flung him off and stepped towards Lily. At that moment, a wave of blood came up his throat and gushed from his mouth, and he fell back across the bed. The nurse ran to him. She put a basin under his head and then stood uncertainly. Get the doctor, Lily said. The nurse ran out, and she and Jack lifted Lothar's legs onto the bed. He's dead, she said. Jack put his head on Lotha's chest. He could not hear a heartbeat nor feel breathing. Christ, he said. I've killed him. She took him into the waiting room. You asked me not to fight, he said. She started to speak and then shrugged her shoulders. You knew this would happen, he said. Again he saw his fist sinking into Lotha's broken belly. He wanted the money just as badly as you, she said. You can live someone's life for him. But you tried to stop me. Her face had hardened. It wasn't my business. I shouldn't have. He was thinking of the other man he had killed. He saw again the body of his mother, the flames licking up Mary's back, the pulpy head that had once belonged to Truman Rutter. I must tell Wilkins, she said. He can get the grave dug. I looked for him. I thought he was here. If he's not at the wagon, he'll be in the Red Mill. He doesn't drink anywhere else. I'll go, he said, glad to leave the hospital. But Wilkins was neither at the wagon nor the Red Mill. The barman denied seeing him that morning, and so did the waitress who usually served his breakfast. Jack went back to the wagon. This time he looked more carefully. A drawer which had held clothing was half open. A few things remained, but were rumpled as though hands had rummaged quickly through them. Jack began to feel sick. There was a washstand with a basin on which Wilkins' shaving soap, razor, and brush had stood. They were gone. He ran back to the Red Mill. When did you last see Wilkins? He called to the barman. Last night, after the fight. He was standing a few rounds. A man at the bar said, I saw him later than that. When? Midnight. A little before, maybe. Where? Crossing the square. He was carrying a bag. Jack ran across the square. At the transport office of Halls and Co., he pushed his way to the head of a crowd of diggers waiting for mail and shouted at the clerk, Did you have a coach out last night? The clerk, who was sorting letters, took his time. He did not like being shouted at. But when he did look up and saw the size of the man and the expression on his face, he said hastily, there was a southbound mail left at midnight. Was it full? He looked at the manifest in front of him. There was one place left. Then he looked more closely. No, there wasn't. It was taken. The coach left full. Jack walked out into the hot sunlight. It was early afternoon. The coach would be nearly 50 miles away. There was no way in the world that he was ever going to catch up with Wilkins, even if he had the money to hire his own coach. He walked slowly and aimlessly out into the desert. Wee, 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 wee. Wee, 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 wee. There is always the possibility of doing something, Peter Ahrens said. Nothing is hopeless, Lily. Arendt, Lily, and Jack were in Aaron's house, in what he called the music room. It was elegantly appointed, with a wooden floor. It also had wooden walls, the first Jack had seen. The prevailing color was blue. There were two blue velvet buttoned backed chairs and a settee. There was also a Bluthner grand piano and two music stands for string or woodwind players. When he could find partners, Peter liked to play trios. It was a few days after Luther's funeral, and Aaron, to Jack's annoyance, had put himself in charge of organizing Lily's future. Let us see, he continued. On the one side, Wilkins has gone with the money. But you are not penniless. There are assets. Assets? Jack said. Property. The wagons, for example. There are three wagons and the platform from which you sing, Lily. Not much, but something. And the meals, she said. And the meals. I've got to have somewhere to stay. I must keep one wagon. So there are two wagons and mules. As you say, not much. Suddenly she laughed, and in a second it seemed as if the depression, which had gripped her since Lothar had died and Wilkins had decamped, vanished. I'll be all right, she said. I've been in worse fixes than this. I've got a roof over my head and a few pounds. Some of the poor devils here haven't half as much. And you have something much more valuable, Aaron said. What's that? First, your voice. Second, your beauty. That's very gallant. It is nothing but the truth. Jack hated him for saying the things that he, Jack, would never have dared to say. If you will forgive me, I have a suggestion, Aaron said. Stay in Kimberley a while. You have nowhere better to go. I know many Lipschitz, the owner of the Grand Music Hall. Why should you not work there? You mean permanently? She said. Why not? I have never stayed in one place for long. It is worth trying. I have talked to him about you. What did you say, Jack? There was nothing he wanted more than for her to stay in town, but this was not the way he had visualized it happening. You'd best make up your mind, he said. Will you come to the music hall with me? He hesitated. Please? The Grand Music Hall molded itself on the Augiel rooms in Leicester, Leicester Square, London. Many Lipschitz interviewed Lily in his office. He was a thin man of middle height, stooped and balding, with a permanently weary expression on his face. He was wearing a dark blue smoking jacket with food stains down the front. His eyes brightened momentarily when he shook Jack's hand. What a fight, he said. What fisticuffs! I've never saw better, not even in London. He had a habit of sucking noisily through his prominent front teeth. Reluctantly, he turned to Lily. So, you can sing. Aaron says you're the best. But singers I can get by the dozen. Not like her, Jack said. Any sort? Juggling singers, fire eating singers, acrobatic singers, singers who dance, dancers who sing. What can you do, dear? Jack shifted angrily and would have spoken, but Lily stopped him. I'm a standing singer, she said sharply. Lipschitz shrugged. So you're a better singer. So you better sing. He led the way into the interior of the theater. It smelled of stale stale tobacco, stale tobacco smoke, stale tobacco smoke. Along one side was a wine bar. I ain't got a pianist tonight. Can you sing without one? Lily sang three songs. Two were popular romantic ballads, the third, an aria from an operetta. Jack had stayed in the rear of the darkened room. The stage was lit by a single lamp, and he could hardly see her. But her voice, thin at first without an accompaniment, swelled to fill the theater. When she had finished, he rose from his seat, clapping loudly. Very nice, very nice, Lipschitz said. He sucked through his teeth. You got a nice voice there. But he raised his hands and shoulders. Like I told you, singing ain't enough. Not in this town. He turned to Jack. But you, my boy, I can use you. You want him to sing, Lily said. Eh. Have your joke fighting. That's what I'm talking about. You're a famous man, Mr. Fawson. What I'm offering is what that big tattooed man was doing. 3 rounds against all comers. 50 quid if they knocks you out. Jack was taken by surprise. He looked first at Manny Lipschitz, then at Lily. Seeing her flushed and angry face, he suddenly knew what to do. I'll fight, he said, but only on one condition. We ain't even got a contract yet, and he's making conditions. I'll only fight if Lily sings. Lipschitz paused. Is it absurd? I don't know. Sucked his teeth, then gave a weary sigh. Everyone always said Manny Lipschitz was an easy touch. So, Jack began a new way of life. He continued to work on the claim by day, but then, instead of returning to the tent, would go directly to the Grand. He would wash there in real hot water and put on the calf-length trousers and soft leather boots which Lipschitz had bought for him. The show included the usual music hall players, the baritone, the juggler, and magician, the dance duet, the declaimer of verse, the stand-up comic. Most were employed for a few nights at a time, or at best, a week. Or else there was touring companies that might present a review. The strong theatrical meat, like Shakespeare, would be found at the Lanyon or the Theatre Royal, not at the Grand. Lipschitz catered for the digger out for an evening's entertainment with a few quid in his pocket and a liking for broad humor and language. Jack and Lily were the only permanent members of the company. Getting there early meant that he could eat a decent meal at the wine bar for half the cost to the public, but above all, he could see Lily. In spite of putting a little aside each week to pay David some of the loss he had incurred when the diamond had been sold in the brothel, Jack would often have enough left over to buy her a glass of wine or a plate of food. In later memories, it was Lily who colored this time for him. In reality, he did not see very much of her. His own toil kept him occupied during the day, and in the evening she would arrive only a few minutes before her first song and leave immediately after her last. Jack had no idea how she filled her time. Once he had asked her, and she had said, I read a lot. When he pursued it, she said, Jack, I'm more grateful to you than I can ever say, but don't question me. I've lived my own life since I was 16. I don't owe explanations. He had to put up with that. His problem was that though he wanted her, he had no idea how to get her. His usual rough and tumble methods, learned in 100 brothels, were not, he knew, going to work with Lily. So he bided his time. Lily, on her side, treated him with a friendliness he had never experienced from a woman. She treated him like an adult and made him feel a man. Mary treated him like youth. This period was also marked by his physical exhaustion. By day, he still did the brutal work at the claim, and by night he boxed at least one match of 3 rounds. Sometimes, on a Saturday night, he might have 2 matches. Occasionally, young men would challenge him to a private fight with money on the side. Lipschitz was delighted with him and both the evening around his appearance. Sometimes he would keep him late if he thought he could get a better house, and Jack would stumble off to the tent at midnight or 1 in the morning, knowing he had only 4 or 5 hours sleep before returning to the claim and the endless digging. The claim yielded just enough to make it worthwhile continuing. Jack did not mind the work. He liked being outside in the sun, liked the feeling of strength in his body. But there were dark clouds. He and David had spoken to each other for weeks. He knew he had hurt him by asking Dan Halkett to be his second in the fight. But he also felt that things were not entirely his fault. He had done wrong to spend the diamond money, and it was a measure of his changing sensibilities that the, that the thought touched him at all. But he was paying it back. Sometimes he felt David was on the point of saying something, anything. A remark on the weather would have been enough to start the healing process. And sometimes he, too, felt an overwhelming urge to speak. But the moment would pass, and they would look at each other and turn away. Lily heard about the situation, and on one night she said to Jack, "Couldn't you bring yourself to make it up?" He had replied angrily, "Why don't you ask him?" She had not mentioned the subject again. Then there was Peter Errant. Lily was seeing him. Jack told himself that it was because Aaron knew about music and thus gave them common ground. But there was more to it than that, and he had transferred the jealousy he had felt for Lothar to Aaron. He did not like the plump young German, but had to acknowledge that these feelings had nothing to do with Lily, for he had disliked him before she had arrived in Kimberley. Aaron had been decent to him, yet there was something about the soft white skin that repelled him. Months ago he had mentioned this to David, who had replied, "He's different, that's all." He began to brood about Lily and Aaron. The long hours on the claim, with nothing else to think about, were fertile ground for such thoughts, and his frustration became so great he was like a volcano, with anger bubbling just below the surface. The only time he could release the pressure was when he boxed. When he had first started, his idea had been to stay on his feet, keep his opponent's fists away from his face, and at last out 3 rounds without being knocked or hurt. Now things changed. He began to fight, to hurt people, to knock them out. The diggers in the audience did not like it. Just as they had paid to see Jack fight Lothar and cheered him on, so they liked to cheer their fellow diggers when they got into the ring with Jack himself. They hardly expected them to win, but the bond of fraternity allowed them to hope. As Jack began to savage one challenger after another, they began to hate him for it. Lily spoke to him about it. "It almost looks as though you want to hurt them," she said one day after a young digger had been carried out with a smashed nose. "It's them or me. They're only boys." A week later he went into the ring with a big Italian. The man had come into the Grand with 3 or 4 other Italians, whose claim had produced a good quality stone. They made a noise and drank a lot. When Lily sang they had set up a chant, "Bella, Bella, Bella," and carried her from the stage at the end of a number and bought her a drink at the bar. It was nothing more than high spirits, and Lily enjoyed it as much as the Italians, but Jack watched them dourly. Then one of the men put his name down for the 50-pound challenge, and Jack beat him about the head so severely that he broke his jaw and closed one of his eyes. The diggers booed him, and the grand emptied rapidly, few people remaining to hear Lily sing her final song. Lipschitz told him, "You're overdoing it, son." Jack produced Wogan's aphorism about being the one the audience loved to hate. Lipschitz shook his head. Some people can do it, and some can't. That, to- that tattooed man was a foreigner, a stranger. He looked as though he could be downed, and people came because one day they knew he would. One day he'll be put down too, son. But no one thinks it at the moment. You're one of them, but you're doing it to them, and they don't like it. Takings fell. Then the number of challengers diminished, and some evenings Jack found that he was not boxing at all. A week later, his worst suspicions about Lily were confirmed. He had broken the handle of his pick and had come into the town to buy a new one. It was mid afternoon and very hot. He was about to turn into the shop when he saw her. She was hurrying along Stockdale Street, her red dress making a splash of color in the bright sunshine. He opened his mouth to call her, but something stopped him. Instead, he waited until she had gone a good distance and then followed. She turned into an alley and knocked on the door of a wooden framed house. It was open immediately, and she disappeared inside. It was Aaron's house. He stood in the alley, feeling anger build up inside him. Christ, he thought. She went into his house like a whore in the afternoon. Anyone might have seen her, and she didn't care. He waited outside for about 10 minutes until, of their own volition, his legs carried him to the door. He knocked. He heard voices, but no one came. He opened the door and stepped inside. The voices were loud and were coming from the music room at the end of the short corridor. He realized he was trespassing, but he could not stop now. He went along the passage, paused, and listened. Why not? It was Aaron's voice. Because I can't, Lily said. Cannot or will not. It's the same thing. Don't you understand that? I will drive you. I will make you. You wouldn't dare. You have a beautiful chance. I won't. Jack threw back the door and crashed into the room, half expecting to see Lily's clothes being ripped off. There was the piano and the settee as he remembered them. Music was strewn over the chairs and piles of it lay on top of the piano. Aaron was standing near the instrument, and Lily was in the middle of the room. With a roar, Jack grabbed the German and threw him against the wall so that the house shook. Lily screamed. "He won't touch you again," Jack shouted. He took her by the arm and pulled her from the house. She struggled every step of the way, and when they reached the boardwalk, she managed to turn and, using her free hand, slapped him across the mouth. He shook himself like a dog. "What are you doing?" she shrieked. Passers-by stopped in their tracks instead. "You ain't never going to see him again," he said. "You don't own me. If he touches you again, I'll kill him. If he..." She suddenly threw back her head and laughed. "God, Jack, you are a baby." "What?" "Come." She caught him by the sleeve and tugged him back into the house. Aaron looked out somewhat fearfully from the door of the music room. "Jack thinks..." Lily began. "Well, never mind." She turned to Jack and pointed to the settee. "Sit." "But..." "Not a word. Not a single word. Just listen." "Now, Peter, you tell him." Aaron eyed him speculatively. "My God," he said. "Save me from jealous lovers." "Don't exaggerate," Lily said, smiling. "Now tell him. Do you know anything about singing? Aaron said. No, Jack said grimly. He sat hunched on the settee, making it look flimsy, his big hands clenched on his lap. Lily has a good voice, you know that. Jack nodded. But it's better than good, or at least it could be. She has the possibility to be a great star in opera if she wishes, but her voice lacks training. We are trying to give it flexibility. Jack watched Lily as Aaron spoke. She was listening intently. She has what we call a mezzo range, a middle range. I think her voice can go up higher than that to color, 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 coloratura, coloratura. There are many who can sing mezzo, but a few can be coloraturas. She sings differently. I know what I can do. Nonsense, my dear. You are made for the Italian Ottocento operas. Bellini, Donizetti. You'll be famous for one. You'll be famous one day. I will make you famous. I can't do it. Of course you can. You have a throat of steel and a stomach muscles like a horse. They had forgotten Jack. Now, please, we will try que la voix from Puritani. Jack was cowed when they left the house, but Lily, who had been flattered by the wildness of his jealousy, took his arm as they walked to the Grand. Lipschitz saw them come in and called Jack. In his office, he pushed a small bundle of notes across the table. What's this for? Jack asked. Notice. Of what? You don't work here no more, son. I like you. Don't make any mistake. But he raised his hands, palms up. I gotta cater for the public. You understand? It did not come as much of a surprise, and Jack took the money. Yeah, I'm sick of it anyway. What about Lily? She's a good girl, and she's got a nice voice. This ain't the place for operas, but if she wants, she can stay. He found Lily backstage and told her. It's a shame, she said. But perhaps it's for the best. You'd have been hurt one day like Lothar. They went out for a late supper, and he took her back to a wagon, which was parked on the square. I've got a drop of French brandy, she said. Do you fancy a glass? She lit the lamp and closed the curtains, and the wagon was suddenly feminine, intimate. It's strange how things fall out. Without you, I'd never have gotten the job. Now it's me that stays and you that goes. I'll never forget what you did for me, Jack. She sipped the brandy. Then she said, You know, digging isn't everything. There are other things. Someone like you should be able to get on, especially now that people know you. There was something in the paper today about a job in the transport business. She found the diamond and fowl advertiser. Here. She turned a page and folded it. Read that. She tapped the boxed advertisement and passed the newspaper to him. He held it at arm's length and scowled at the page. Then he cleared his throat. Which one? She came closer and pointed to the place. Just what she'd be good at. He strained to concentrate. He could make out individual letters just as he had been able to make out those on the box in the tent, but they would not form any recognizable pattern. He brought the paper close. He suddenly seemed to have become nearsighted. He felt that, like David, that he must realize what was wrong, and all at once he said in a low voice, Um, it ain't no use. What is it? The job? Mm-mm. I can't read it. I've never been able. Oh, oh, Jack. She put her hand on his arm. The blood was in his face. Uh, Never mind. Not everyone gets the chance to learn. It's nothing to be ashamed of. If you like, I'll teach you. Would you? Of course I will. On impulse, she put her arm around his neck and kissed him on the cheek. It was like touching off a charge of powder. He grabbed her. He turned so that he was facing her and kissed her on the lips. But he could not wait. Something the size of one of his own fists seemed to grab his stomach and squeeze it. His legs felt as though they had become water. But he would not. She was a strong woman, but he held her fast. He heard fabric tear, then felt the heat of her skin under his hands. He was past hearing. He was feeling her, seeing it's nothing except a blow on the head would have stopped him. He found himself on top of her, and then realized she was no longer struggling, but had locked her arms behind his head. He clawed and heard again, and then felt himself sinking. The bed was a narrow bunk, far too small for such going ons, and his feet was flailing there. Pots and pans came crashing down. There was a thud as one of boots struck the wooden floor. He was hardly aware of the wagon rocking. He came to like drowned people slowly breaking water surface. By some miracle, the lamp still hung from its hook in its roof, and out of the corner of his eye he saw the wreckage. At first glance, it appeared that a tornado had struck the wagon. Books, papers, pots, pans, cups, saucers, all lay in a heap on the floor. He was relaxed, and his body had dead weight. Jack's onslaught had been violent, that his own shirt had lost all its buttons and was torn away. That night, as he lay in his tent listening to David's breathing, he felt for the first time in weeks a sense of depression and insecurity. Had he taken too much for granted? In all the hours and days they had been together, she had said many things, but never, I love you. Why was that? He wondered. It couldn't be because they didn't. They could not be as close as they were and not love each other. Then he thought, is this what she had had with Lothar? But he did manage to persuade her to agree about one thing: to sell the wagon and the mules and live in a house. They found a simple two-roomed shack with a roof that let the water in when it rained. But the comparison with the wagon, it was vast. He tried to give her some money to buy furniture, but she bought what she needed out of her own pocket at the Saturday auctions. Her first purchase was a big brass bedstead. She furnished the place on next to nothing, and soon he was spending every spare minute there. He painted it and fixed the leaks. He managed to buy some planks cheaply, and he put in a floor. Soon the house was comfortable and cozy. Sometimes she would let him stay for a whole night, and sometimes not, depending on the mood, and he had to be content with that.